we've been used to for a while, the ability to have a relatively shared set of facts and information. But now, it feels like we're increasingly being channeled
Yeah.
into incommensurable world spaces. Algorithms they're not neutral. They don't just reflect bias. They actually are transforming our human cognition in the process of their operation. There's a kind of paradox that we're in right now. The very cognitive tools that we use normally to analyze our situation are in themselves undergoing transformation under the influence of the algorithmic undertow and the other things going on, just the complexity of the environment we're in. So the tools that we're using themselves are changing. It's a very difficult situation. It's like trying to analyze the effects of drinking while drinking.
Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to I Am Insider, the show where we highlight the work of the Institute of Applied Metatheory and the work of our contributors. And to that end, I'm really pleased to welcome Bruce Alderman, who has been with I Am from the very start. To talk a little bit about his really powerful white paper that was published about a month and a half ago called Polarization and the Algorithmic Undertow. Bruce, thank you for joining me here today to talk about this a little bit. I think it's honestly, it's a really foundational paper for what the work of I am is doing right now, but the larger field that we're all a part of is really working on. I think there are so many elements of what we consider the meta crisis that have kind of their, if not their root cause, at least a highly contributing cause in the polarization and the sort of digital derealization that we're experiencing right now. So I just think this paper is really foundational to exploring that. And I thank you for sharing it, and I thank you for writing it. And yeah, I thought maybe you could start us off just by explaining a little bit about why you felt moved to write this paper now.
Sure. Well, yeah, thank you for the welcome. And I think like all of us, probably we've been noticing polarization in our own circles and in our own families, and of course, broadly across the country, and increasing seeming breakdown in the ability to have shared meaning and shared frames. And it was actually privately in a conversation with Corey that that word just popped out of me to try to explain my feeling of this slow, relentless pull into these different spheres of meaning and sense making, that algorithmic undertow. And really, the paper took shape around me thinking about if algorithmic undertow is an appropriate word for something that's happening, what is it? What is it doing? How do we understand its operation? How do we begin to address it? And naturally, with the Institute of Applied Metatheory, we've been focusing on a number of core metatheories. And prior to that work, with Sean S. Bjorn Hargens and Nick Hedlund and other people, we've been exploring intersections of integral theory and critical realism and complex thought and some of those key frames. So I just looked to those naturally to see how could those be used to illuminate that possible phenomenon, which I felt just intuitively fit. And just as an aside, I had a meeting yesterday with Brian Swim,
Hmm.
and he just has, I think, finished working on a book with his son on the noosphere and really exploring the dynamics of the emerging, shared consciousness, socially mediated and internet mediated, and now AI influenced sphere of intelligence that's enveloping the planet. And he just remarked to me that he felt this was such an important term and wanted to know where it came from because for him it made sense that it made
Yeah.
a lot of sense of things that he was observing in the process of writing that book.
Yeah, it is a really powerful term, and I think what kind of resonates is this idea of an undertow, in particular, as kind of a motion for the way in which this pulls on us. I think you said just a bit ago something about the sort of slow but steady kind of draw that this is having on us, and it really does feel that way. And I notice my own behavior in terms of how I interact online around, all kinds of exchange of ideas. And it feels like an undertow, like something that is pulling down from underneath, that's kind of pulling us away from the sort of presence um, that we generally try to bring to our lives. So I think you've really stumbled upon a term that kind of captures what it feels like in our daily lives.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of points I was thinking about in relationship to that, just what was motivating me, and maybe an outside frame thing first. One thing that was occurring to me just recently, and I think it's a natural assumption, not a great insight, but it fits for me, which is a century ago, a little bit over a century ago, it was really breaking through for us this idea that there's a cognitive unconscious that
Hmm.
shapes behavior from underneath. It's not observed, but it's definitely influencing behavior and decisions and things like that. And similarly, following in the wake of that, Marx started looking, for instance, at you know how means of production are shaping certain key elements in society. And so it feels like, with our awareness now of the influence of algorithms and other aspects of our digital technologies, we're becoming aware in some ways of a structural unconscious
Yep.
that is pulling us in particular directions of collective organization and meaning making and decision taking and all of that. So that's kind of a background frame, but I think you know we're at an inflection point with digital technology right now. It's been we've been adjusting to it in the last decade and a half or so, 2 decades, and I think it's coming to a point where we're now really being called to reflect
Yep.
on the consequences of this rapid adoption and these rapid
Yep.
shifts, and so I think it's natural that we maybe use some things that we've learned in reflecting on other structural influences in cognition and economics and things like that on this bigger sphere, uh,
Yep.
yeah, that we're immersed in. And generative AI, I think it's really important for us to be thinking about this in the face of generative AI. One, because generative AI, if it's being disseminated and used within a context that doesn't have mindfulness of these dynamics, it's just going to be further
Yep.
amplifying. But also because generative AI is getting to a point where it can be a really useful cognitive tool to help us, especially if we, use AI in a way like I am is trying to use it as a thought amplifying tool for sense making. So I think it's a really important inflection point for us to be taking this up right now.
Yeah, I think I mean there's so many different directions we could go there, but it reminds me you're sort of drawing the link between the sort of algorithmic undertow and now the new wave that's cresting now of AI. It makes me think of the sort of Tristan Harris was early on in the sort of AI bubble that we're currently in, was sort of labeling um, the kind of algorithmic polarization that we were seeing with social media as being sort of 1.0 version of which AI is the 2.0 version. And I think there's a lot of similarities there. There's a really powerful piece of truth there, but I also share your hope that there are ways in which you could see AI mitigating some of the polarization effects and sense-making fragmentation effects of, social media 1.0 and that sort of algorithm 1.0. The other thing I wanted to comment on, it actually is a really good segue. You were talking about how, a century ago, this concept of the dynamic unconscious being something that came to light and something that we began to understand, that you could have these below the surface sort of causes leading to above the surface effects, and that the same thing is happening now as we understand the ways in which algorithms and social media and the internet are shaping things below the surface that give rise to these larger manifestations, is a really great segue to talk a little bit about the two metatheoretical frames that you used to analyze this phenomenon in your paper. The first one, which most of our listeners will be familiar with, is integral metatheory. But the second one, critical realism, is something that I would say that a lot of people in this space that we are in have a little bit less familiarity with. So I'd love to hear in particular what you think critical realism and its sort of understanding of these different depth dimensions, ontological depth dimensions, adds to the analysis of this phenomenon.
Sure. Yeah, I think everyone familiar with integral theory especially will know that it's really good at breadth.
Yep.
It can help us cover, you know, all of the essential spaces, our subjective and intersubjective, objective and systemic. And, all of those are important to include in any analysis. And there are ways to look at depth within integral theory that are powerful. And for instance, the developmental lines and forms of meaning making. And I think that remains essential to look at. Some of the dynamics that we're experiencing right now are related not only to the different quadrants in which they appear, but the different stages that are engaging with the dynamics in any of those territories. But critical realism brings in vertical depth in a different way, which is really looking at, because critical realism formed around understanding the practice of science and how science works. And science is really an enterprise of creating conditions in which usually obscured or hidden generative mechanisms can be surfaced so that we can identify what are some understructures that are actually causing phenomena that we can observe at the empirical level. And, labs and other things are set up to create conditions that you can begin to isolate what are generative mechanisms. And so the whole strata that critical realism talks about with the real at the level of the generative mechanisms and the actual and the empirical, which we can talk about in more depth later. But I think that brings another important lens that really is not surfaced very much in the integral discussions. I think there are ways we can get there, but critical realism does it in a very clear and clarifying way. So I felt that it was important to bring in, and there are a couple ideas from critical realism that are important, I think, and we can go into them more later. But for one, it's like absence as a generative
Hmm.
force,
Hmm.
right? That it's looking, you know, showing that digital space is actively absent some things, and there are actually ontological and epistemological consequences of that active absencing of things. And then there's the notion of demirealities,
Hmm.
and yeah, we can maybe go into more depth about what a demi-reality is later. But the simply just talking about how it's they're they're worlds that are partial, but they feel whole, and they tend to be circularly self-validating.
Yep.
And he was talking about that not in the context of digital environments, but just generally socially, because we recognize ideology and a lot of other things already function in that way. What this paper is looking at is kind of digital versions of that. And there's a strong focus in critical realism on emergence and stratification of phenomena. right? And again, Integral is very much on board with this perspective of emergence at different forms of whole making that are unfold over time and in different contexts. And so it's not, critical realism isn't bringing in something that Integral doesn't recognize, but it's bringing it in a way that is, which I try to use in the paper. It does it in a way that's actionable and clarifying. So yeah, those are some of the reasons, I'd say.
Yeah, and I hope to be able to dive in on each of those different lenses that you just described a little bit. But I also just want to commend you for sort of leading the way in this, to use a sort of new term, a sort of art disciplinary way of approaching this by actually taking different integrative meta theories, different big pictures that in themselves are so complex and holistic and comprehensive that they could almost in and of themselves start to feel like they are capturing the totality of what's going on. And what's so beautiful when we're able to layer in multiple big pictures, multiple integrative meta theories onto the same phenomenon, it shows that reality is even more complex than even our most complex thinking can grasp around it. But by pulling these big pictures together, overlapping them, using them as different layers to get to disclose different aspects of reality, you get this sort of synergistic effect by bringing in multiple ones. And I know that's work that you have been involved in since the beginning of this kind of critical realism and integral theory dialogue. And it's really nice to start seeing the actual intellectual fruits of that in an applied way by bringing in these two different super zoomed out lenses to disclose different aspects of reality. So I just want to commend you in your leadership of that.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's begin to walk a little bit through the paper itself. I'm not going to go through it. Of course, we will link to this paper and we invite people to read it. I don't want to go through it to such a high level of detail that, there's a lot of really, really rich stuff and a lot of really, in particular, in some of the charts that you've done using these different frameworks. There's a lot of detail there that's rich, and I want to point people to it. But I want to kind of walk through a couple of the key elements of it, and we can unpack those a little bit. I was struck by a quote at the beginning where you said something along the lines, in terms of speaking about the shift from our local information ecosystems that we've existed in for essentially our entire evolutionary history to the sort of emerging global noosphere informational ecosystem that we're now plunged into as being like developmental children stumbling through a cognitive environment that our species never evolved to navigate. It really jumped out at me, and it points to something that I feel is actually missed by much social criticism of our current sort of state of affairs. I think there's a tendency for social critics to be able to, to point out how badly a job we're doing right now with facing this kind of an epistemic challenge. And I just don't look at it that way. I see that to some degree, this move we've made from local, Dunbar number, interpersonal relationship and communication to this highly distributed, over-connected, you know, um, digital reality that we're in now as being almost an like unprecedented, certainly unprecedented, but also inevitable in a way that I think, I can almost imagine if I imagine some alien species on another planet, going through its own cultural and sociological evolutionary development, having to to navigate just this transition and challenge that we're facing now. And that in some sense, if we're going to become, the kind of society that we all dream is possible, navigating the space that we're in now is going to be paramount, and is something not to just dismiss as like, oh, we're failing. Like, this is a big challenge that we're up against. And when I zoom out the most, that's kind of what I'm left with. And I feel like this quote that you have in the paper really gets to that. I'd like to bring in, if I may, one other quote, one of my favorites from an interview that was done with Penn Jillette in Vulture magazine in 2018, and he encapsulated this sort of dynamic that I'm talking about in a way that I thought was brilliant. He said, for 50 million years, our biggest problems were too few calories and too little information. And for about 50 years, our biggest problem has been too many calories and too much information. We have to adjust, and I believe that we really end up, we will really fast, but I also believe that it will be wickedly ugly while we're adjusting. Well, that he said that in 2018. I think it's fair to say now in 2025 that we are in the wickedly ugly phase of that adjustment. In fact, I would bet that Penn Jillette would probably agree that in 2018 we hadn't even begun to really see the true manifestation that we're seeing now of this. So how would you place, like, given as much attention as we do around polarization and the sort of our digital environment impacting that, um, what would you say, like, are we underestimating or overestimating the impact of this sort of, algorithmic undertow on our sense making and meaning making, or are we perhaps, yeah, underestimating it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the best, the responsible answer is time will tell. But I can tell you my intuitive response just is that we are underestimating it, right? Indeed, I can at least say in listening to it being discussed in multiple circles, I don't really hear it being addressed in the way that I feel is important to address it. And I love that quote you just gave from Penn Jillette. And yeah, we evolved, in conditions of information scarcity, right? And really face-to-face communication and sensory grounded environments, right? We had, that was what we have lived in for so long. And we're now what I was calling a noospheric cloud. We're in this just onslaught of decontextualized information coming at us all the time. And one of the things that I think is important to think about in that and to really look at and analyze is that we're it's not only a change in the information that's around us, it's actually it's actually impacting our restructuring our attention, how we hold attention, and how we form beliefs, and you know the process of social cognition. All of those things are different in this new environment, and I don't think we've really fully come to terms, with those kinds of deeper generative structural changes that are happening. And partly because it's happening so quickly, it's happening, at breakneck speed. And normally, these kinds of changes evolutionarily have taken place over centuries, and there's plenty of time. Even though they can be disruptive, there's enough room for cultural buffer to at least absorb some of what's going on. And we're actually
Yep.
we're bumping along really quick with rapid changes. And like writing and printing and even industrial revolution, those happen relatively quickly, but not at this pace, with this rapid access to all these things around the world, all at once. And so I think it is an unprecedented environment, and maybe some unprecedented consequences. And one that's interesting to think about is concepts like knowledge and expertise and evidence. Those evolved in different information environments than we're
Hmm.
actually in right now. And so, sometimes you hear people talk about a legitimation crisis, and that's part of that, because those, bulwarks of proper, epistemic, exercise, hygiene. I don't even know the right words
Yeah,
to use there.
gatekeeping or whatever
Yeah.
you would call it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Those are, kind of being undermined. And,
yeah.
so now there's too much raw information and too little context. Uh, so that's just really undermining those prior foundational elements, and we need to reassess or find new ways of generating those things within this new environment. And I think we're still feeling our way through that. And, we'll get into it later, but, this, because of the, we've always had, different cultures, different worldviews and religions, but we've been used to for a while the ability to have a relatively shared set of facts and information that we all could then deliberate about from our different perspectives. But now, it feels like we're increasingly being channeled
Yeah.
into incommensurable world spaces where, even because of the active absencing and other things that are going on, it's not even, it's much harder to even get shared agreement around events and facts and all of that. And then that creates cascading effects across multiple quadrants. So it's just really, really complex. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
there's just a sort of threshold that we've crossed. I mean, I think about the incredible growth, for example, in knowledge that happens when cultures intersect for the first time, when you have these different communication technologies or transportation technologies that have facilitated historically the exchange of worldview, information, goods, knowledge, that there have been these really, really fruitful sort of flowerings that have come from that cross-cultural, cross-perspective, cross-informational exchange. But we've gotten to this point now where that flood is so uninhibited of new information, new perspectives, that you can see why, to move a little bit into the political realm, there's such a strong desire to return to a previous level of, culture, society, identity, you know, uh, understanding of the world, because it is seemingly the only response to the overwhelming complexity and flood of information and perspectives that we face now. And so I feel like we in the sort of integrative community are the only ones saying, like, there is a possibility besides regression.
yeah, yeah.
uh, to be able to manage this. It's hard, but there is something on the other side of this that's quite powerful and beautiful. And I think when we get to some of your sort of more prescriptive um, sections of the paper later on, we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah. There's a kind of paradox that we're in right now, in that the very cognitive tools that we use normally to analyze our situation are in themselves undergoing transformation. And under the influence of the algorithmic undertow and the other things going on, just the complexity of the environment we're in. So the tools that we're using themselves are changing, and so it's a very difficult situation. It's like trying to analyze the effects of drinking while drinking.
Right. That's a great metaphor. Yeah, I love that. So let's talk a little bit. I want to zoom in a little bit on the algorithm part of algorithmic undertow and the title of your paper. So, you titled it Polarity and the Algorithmic Undertow, and it leads me to think that you are placing a pretty high value on the power of selective algorithms in terms of the ways in which those algorithms are not necessarily consciously, but what they're optimizing for is driving a great part of this sort of epistemic fracturing that we're seeing now. And so I wonder if you had to sort of separate out how much of the challenge is truly related to sort of algorithms driving the flow of information versus just, you know, if we can imagine an internet where algorithms weren't driving a lot of what we see in our feeds and in our news or whatever, and we were just allowed to select for ourselves from among the the infinite cornucopia of information. How much of it do you think is just the infinite cornucopia of information that we're now exposed to, and how much of it do you think can be attributed to algorithms shaping those tunnels?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't think there's, any kind of single cause here, and so I wouldn't say algorithms are the only thing driving it. But I would say they're, an impactful force that we need to contend with, and they're not neutral. They definitely operate with a directionality, and they don't just reflect bias. They actually are transforming our human
Hmm.
cognition in
Hmm.
the process of their operation. So I think that there's you know, not only an informational impact but a structural impact that we have to look at. There's just like a continuously shaping, reinforcing, directional movement that shapes belief and behaviors at scale, which then compound. And so I think uh, you know it is a real factor that we have to pay
Hmm.
attention to. That I think you know maybe there's no absolutely neutral information space. There's always going to be economic and political and other things influencing what people put out and how people frame it and what people get access to. But algorithms, because they're so pervasive and really in powerful in the way that they can select and narrow what we experience, that they're really amplifying dynamics that would already be there in a way that we have to contend with.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
yeah, I think that's well said, and that's a good way of putting it. That it's they're doing more than just reflecting our own biases back to us. They're sort of creating that race to the bottom that creates the tunnel. It's like the algorithm is in a sense optimizing for a particular pathway of information processing, and it's not just reflecting our own in given biases, but is taking us in a particular direction.
Yeah. I mean, we have confirmation bias, we have homophily, we like to gather with the people like us. So those are already present, shaping us. But algorithms can really amplify those dynamics in powerful ways.
Yeah. It also reminds me of something we were talking about just a little bit ago, which is that, that idea of scarcity being the kind of overriding evolutionary drive for humanity over, hundreds of thousands of years. And, in some sense, market forces are really optimized to like reduce that scarcity, right? Um, what they're not optimized to do is to what they're not the right tool for is to limit the overabundance that and in some sense it oversolved for, that markets oversolved for, right? Like when you look at, going back to the sort of metaphor of too few calories, too many calories, you know um, market forces are great at, you know, bringing that caloric human need to solving for that sort of a problem. What it's
Mm,
not good at doing is optimizing for the nutritional health once
mm.
you've solved for the calorie problem. And it's sort of the same thing that's happening in the sort of commercial application of social media and those algorithms. Is it's great at solving for the information scarcity problem. It's not great at solving for the quality of the information problem that is then created by that.
Right. That's a great analogy, and yeah, I feel that's right on.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about, so one of the frames that you use in your paper is this, this frame of sort of absences and presencing that's happening. And you, in one of your charts, you use kind of a pre-trans fallacy to display the ways in which um, online discourse and online algorithmically mediated exchange, um, is mimicking the presence of these real elements in what is normal human person to person exchange, and that there's sort of a pre-trans fallacy going on, that like what's actually present in those communications is not anywhere near the real full richness of interpersonal communication. And as I was reading it, it made me reflect a little bit on another. Pre-trans is a Wilberian sort of integral frame, but it reminded me of another sort of Wilberian one that I've used in some writing I've done on this same topic, which is the trade-off between depth and span. And so, for example, when you look at it at this sort of in-person communication and dialogue and exchange and relationality compared to the digital version, if you use this idea of depth and span, it becomes easier to see that what we've essentially traded for is depth, and what we've gained is span. So, yeah, I'm curious what you think about that as a lens on this phenomenon.
I really like it. I think there's something to be said about the pre-trans thing, and that people could idealistically look at what is happening for us as an advance, as something that's
Right.
taking us to the next level, when actually it might be undermining. But when you look at why is it undermining, I think it's exactly what you're pointing to. In many cases, we have dramatically increased span. We have greater reach, greater accessibility, greater speed, all kinds of things like that that are, just ubiquitous now for much of the world. But we've lost, as a trade-off, depth, in a lot of different dimensions, and we could talk about them, but I mean, we've got like the interpersonal depth, that is missing. We can get into again very familiar self-reinforcing little internet clicks, you know, and we just get into simplified mediated interactions. And as people who've worked on forums for many years, that we've long been aware of the trade-offs and the loss that we experience in those environments about the body's posture and the tone of voice and the presence and the ability for us to process and contact each other in real time and in ways that we've lost that kind of depth, right? And so you have to develop new skills to be extra mindful in forum spaces and to kind of fill in the gaps
Yep.
deliberately if you don't want the conversations to go off the rails as they
Yeah.
frequently do.
Yeah.
And we've lost cognitive depth. It's easy to get a lot of quick information, but the speed at which it comes now often doesn't allow a lot of time for real marination and process before we've moved on to
To
the
the
next
next.
thing, right? And even a loss in complexity of perspectives. There's usually complexity of perspectives come when you have to wrestle in a regular way with with competing and conflicting points of view that are harder to escape in a real world environment, in a meeting hall somewhere, but can be escaped relatively easily in a digital environment. And then algorithms help reinforce that. So those all of those things happen. So you could very well look at those things as a loss of depth of interaction and information exchange and processing, that is really significant.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think we had such a we had such a unique example to experience what happens when that depth is removed during the pandemic. I think there was a way in which some people thrived during the pandemic. Some people prefer to sort of, interact through this sort of mediated world, of online world. But I think, it's interesting how many of the consequences that we're just now becoming aware of, the mental health consequences, the political consequences, the sociological consequences, the relational consequences, the health consequences of that period of isolation where all of our exchange, our human relating, our knowledge, our sense making, our meaning making was essentially filtered exclusively through these online mediums. And, I believe that we're going to continue to see the impacts of that time echoing for at least another decade, and the consequences are pretty drastic. It also made me think of the ways in which, as things returned to some sense of normalcy coming out of the pandemic, you know um, there was this push to get back to some degree of in-person relating and in-person working together. And as you say, the perspectival diversity, like being in a room as opposed to being in this digital forum. And I was just reading Ezra Klein's new book Abundance, and he was talking about how, ironically, Zoom, the company whose stock went up during the pandemic, and adoption probably tripled during the pandemic. Zoom was one of the first companies to require their workers to come back to in-person work together. And the CEO, of Zoom said essentially, trust is the coin of the realm for our work together. And trust, we've just found that trust doesn't get built through online collaboration in the way that it does when we're all in the same room together. So I think that really points to what you're talking about here.
Yeah, I think if I took this paper in a new direction or the next step to it, I'm thinking about that in the political realm and other areas, but I would want to include that because while the pre-trans fallacy kind of highlights that there's a kind of a pseudo advancement with the technological environment that we're now in, that it actually is leading to fragmentation where it appears to be an advance, but in many ways there's a
Yep.
fragmentation. But there's a way to hold that would actually be well, I could say another way, just that it's almost I think a more fruitful, more generative frame that doesn't pathologize the 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 increased span that we have. It just points out that the increased span by itself is a deficiency if we don't find ways to bring in increased depth in that new environment. And so I think that's a really important framing there that I'd want to carry forward.
I'd love to hear you do that. I mean, it really does point to some ways in which you might be able to, and you certainly point to some ways in the latter part of your paper about ways that we could bring some of that depth back in. But I would love to hear you, explore a little bit about how we might return to some of that depth. And also sort of there's one possible path of like, how might you return, online interactions and discourse to pull back in some of that depth. And I think that's part of the solution. And there's also just recognizing the ways in which that will never fulfill that full spectrum depth, and to help encourage people to continue to nurture, the full human depth of expression, relation, communication, debate, dialogue, problem solving, that that will always be a need in the human, in a human, to be able to have that full depth ability to exchange.
Yeah. Yeah. My next project, if I finish it, I've started working on it, but it's looking at how these dynamics of the algorithmic undertow have made possible for this particular year certain rapid, coordinated, governmental changes and movements and things like that to unfold in a way that they're getting actually less resistance and attention than they might have gotten a decade or two ago because of this fragmentation and the different algorithmic tunnels that people inhabit now, on the different demi-realities that people are inhabiting now, that it's really hard to come to any consensus or coordinate collective action. And so it's actually facilitated some of what we see unfolding right now. And so that's something I want to look at. And the reason I'm bringing it up is in that paper, while I talk in this one about different ways to bring depth into our engagement with social media, this paper I'm wanting to explore, how do we bring depth into our democratic process in
Yeah.
this new digital environment.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really important piece, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about it, Bruce. So you mentioned demi-reality, so I want to turn actually to that concept next, and I'm going to do that. I want to highlight one of the quotes from your paper that really stood out to me. So you said by systematically absenting elements like direct human contact, temporal awareness, and cognitive diversity, digital environments generate new presences that reinforce division, binary narratives, tribal identities, and echo chambers arise in place of nuanced, reflective dialogue, creating isolated digital demi-realities that are resistant to alternative perspectives. In these demi-realities, each community or group experiences a partial version of reality that feels complete and self-sustaining. So you're referencing here Bhaskar's concept of a demi-reality, and I think it's really adept. Can you share with our audience a little bit about this concept, what Bhaskar meant by it, and what you think it discloses in this phenomenon that we're exploring?
Yeah, there are a couple dimensions to what he means by a demi-reality, and one is it's a partial version of reality that appears complete, but it systematically absents certain things in its own self-maintenance. But another important part about the demi-reality is that it doesn't really have to be real to be causally effective. A demi-reality can be a constellation of perspectives and conclusions and readings that are not actually empirically grounded or defensible, but nevertheless have causal effects in the social sphere and the cultural sphere and also individually. So there's that two sides to it. One, they're kind of partial realities, a false totality. That's a term that's used, but also the actual reality of it is secondary in a way, and so they involve this active process of systematic distortion, right? And they tend to be self-validating. They create conditions that generate internal coherence by filtering out what doesn't fit. And of course, this has been something we know about cults and about different. It's not a new thing, but in a way, we have that process now automated rather than a charismatic leader or a group of people who want to maintain control over a group of people and tell you don't talk to the outsiders, whatever. None of that's necessary now. We've got that in a way automated, where these cult-like circles are being created for all of us. And I think that's an important thing to say, is that while I wanted to work on this because of kind of almost the shock of being regularly confronted by people I know well who are inhabiting such apparently different narrative realities, relatives and friends and other things, that it became important for me to look at this personally. But it's not only because they're all wrong, they're stuck in bubbles, we all are caught up in
Yep.
these dynamics, that we involve, like we talked before, that the dialectic of presence and absence, where definitely presences certain narratives and then it actively absences those things. And, Boscar's point again is that active exclusion, that absenting, is not just something that's not there, but by absenting it, it actually has causal effects in the whole
Hmm.
system, right?
Hmm.
Both within the system and around the system. And so we've really got to pay, attention to that. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like one of the primary drivers of evolution in a certain sense is reality's ability to select for itself and crashing in and penetrating our demi-realities in ways that keep us attuned to what's actually happening, and orient us towards, again, in some sense, all of our mental constructions are social constructions, and they're um, they are always not going to be total. They're not going to contain reality in a total way. However, we're kept on that path towards truth by the intrusion of reality into our demi-realities. And I feel like what makes this algorithmic undertow such an insidious phenomenon is that it's built up these really, really powerful self-contained, as you say, self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating walls around our demi-realities, such that we can stay inside them without the encounter of difference, without the encounter of alternative viewpoints, without the encounter of having to relate to someone who may see and embody a very different aspect of that reality than we do. um, it's just creating these bubbles around them that gives reality less opportunity to push in and break up those demi-realities, and at least continue to orient them towards some actual shared reality.
Yeah. Yeah. There's dimensions of that are, really interesting. I mean, one is that, when you're in a demi-reality, and maybe it's safe to say that we're all getting pulled into them. But when you look out at some of the perspectives in other demi-realities, it's not just that they're wrong, but that they also appear even ontologically impossible.
Hmm.
So there's this that just creates further impasse to shared meaning making, and then it also really helps. And I think this is a useful thing about what critical realism is bringing and helping us understand is that why does fact checking fail, right?
Hmm.
Because fact checking is it's not really addressing the structural absenting, the structural absences that help keep the demi reality in place. And so just pointing out the facts is it's pretty much ineffective.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And there's also just this element of, you know in the infinite cornucopia of information, you will always be able to find enough. We will now, anyone could find any fact to back up their particular position, and it's legitimate. We've lost the sort of bell curve way of being able to determine which facts are most salient to understanding the situation, and now we can just choose whichever one fits our view of reality.
Yeah, yeah, I think that is it. It was already on Boscar's mind, back when he was working on critical realism. But I think it's even more powerfully important now. And this was he was emphasizing realism in the face of cultural environments which really privileged epistemology over ontology and
Yep.
the play of perspectives over any kind of grounded reality or ability to speak in a in a in a clear way about real generative mechanisms and things like that. And so without that, he was already, and of course, Wilbur himself was also feeling that slide warning about how we're moving in a direction that could slide into a perspectival madness. And, so that's, I think, where we're where we're headed pretty
Yeah,
quickly.
it is so interesting to me just to zoom out for a second and look at our field of, big picture integrative meta theories. To It's so interesting to me to recognize that the flowering of the ideas that we are now have been championing for 20, 25, 30 years in some cases, um, that the early progenitors of those ideas were pointing to something that hadn't actually were pointing to a problem that hadn't actually crashed against the shores of of our daily reality in the way that they are now.
Mm.
And just it's so interesting to me that you have these big figures like Edgar Morin and Ken Wilber and Roy Bhaskar who were pointing to problems that we weren't yet feeling, and now their their ideas, their frameworks are clearly pointing to the solutions that we now need, but weren't as pressing when they actually generated them.
Mhm. Yeah, they were pressing in what looked like isolated little environments.
Yeah, now they're
Yeah,
all of our problems,
yeah,
not just academics or whatever. Yeah. Um, I want to talk a little bit about a couple other kind of pieces that you isolate in this paper. So one of them is you overlay two key kind of frameworks from critical realism and integral meta theories, I think to great effect. Um, you take critical realism's ontological domains of the real, the actual, and the empirical, and then integrals for quadrants of subjective, objective, intersubjective, and interobjective to give a new sort of overlay of how those two frameworks can disclose really important things about the phenomenon of algorithmic undertow. Can you tell us just a little bit about sort of how you thought those two frameworks came together to point to something new?
yeah. We touched on it a little bit at the beginning, and the ability to look at the vertical depth and to also look at the breadth. Those things are very important. And so, for instance, with that stratified reality, the real and the actual, and the empirical, critical realism is inviting us to, yeah, different. When we can't make these differentiations, we often are just addressing what we're experiencing at the level of the empirical, and that usually is a shuffling of the deck chairs, right? And it doesn't really go deep enough. So, the real domain is pointing to generative mechanisms that usually are out of phase with what is actually happening, meaning they're while the actual is there to you, if you want to turn your attention to it, you can see it. The real may be happening in a way that it actually gets occluded, and it's not readily accessible unless you have certain lines of access to it. And usually it takes more concentrated effort to be able to discern and uncover the real generative mechanisms. So it's not that the real generative mechanisms are intrinsically inaccessible and invisible, but they tend to be out of phase with what's happening at the actual, or that they're not something that just can stand forth. You've got to do some work, or gain access to particular kinds of knowledge that would allow that to be disclosed. And we gave that example with the psychoanalysis that the unconscious is not utterly inaccessible, but sometimes we have to notice it through its effects or through other kinds of things, but it takes a certain kind of bracketing and framing in order to be able to call it forward. And so for algorithmic undertow, we've got the economic imperatives and algorithmic design principles, all those decisions that are made that most of the society is not aware of, and they're just corporate power structures that are exerting an influence on what gets deployed, publicly. So all of those things are there, and we need to pay attention to those. So those are the like conditions for algorithmic undertow. And then actual domain is kind of the manifest behaviors that are the things that are actually happening. So these are the recommendation algorithms. These are the content curation. This is like moderation policies. How all of these things are actually, showing up and expressing across our different media, right? And then we've got the empirical domain, which is like the actual stuff that we encounter on our phones and in our feeds, and often by the time we're getting all this, we don't really
Yeah.
feel all of those forces behind there driving what is empirically showing up for us in our everyday experience, right? And if we only try to work on that empirical level,
Right.
we're going to leave a lot out, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's beautifully said, Bruce, and it actually has helped me to understand these three domains in Bhaskar's thought much better than I have before, because I think it's such a great example in some sense of what those different layers do and how they operate and how they influence what we actually observe in the empirical realm. So anyway, I just want to commend you on a really um, just powerful application of that theory itself and showing how these things affect us. Um, another I'd like to sort of move to the final piece of the paper, which is some of your more prescriptive ideas. And the first among them, you gave sort of two levels of sort of specificity here, but one of them, and in fact, I'm going to share my screen with one of your charts, but I wanted to just have you quickly kind of walk us through some of your recommendations in each of the four quadrants that we could be doing individually and collectively as a society to begin to address some of these demi-realities and to presence some of the things that are absent in the ways that we interact with each other online. So let me share this here. All right. So yeah, I was hoping you might actually walk our audience through some of these briefly.
Sure. Yeah. So, in the upper left, we have things like digital mindfulness and algorithmic literacy. So, for digital mindfulness, it would involve becoming aware, just learning about, actually, becoming aware of how algorithmic systems, shape attention and beliefs, and then recognizing the absent alternatives and thought patterns. And really that would start here with just reflecting on, you know, how am I feeling in interacting with this, and paying attention to what you are able to listen to. Well, I can give an example here that I've been watching, which is I can see sometimes in my use of digital media, I'll have a stream of things coming up that I feel inspired to click on, and I can then become aware of the ones that come up that, after having moved along a certain channel for a while, when I see that other piece of information coming along that might be disconfirming, or coming from an angle that I've now got in some investment in, I can
Hmm.
feel the internal resistance to having that impinge on my meaning space. And so bringing mindfulness around that is, of course, to recognize, oh, this is actually happening in my phenomenological experience, my own feelings and my attitudes, and noting that, and just in that noting, being able to make that into an object and not be
Yep.
subject to it, and be able to do something about it. And so related to that is developing algorithmic literacy. And so one way we can, to have that literacy is to recognize that these recommendations and these kinds of things are operating with their own internal logic, which are not necessarily a logic aligned with my own well-being or my own proper condition of being informed. And so for us to actually learn how those things operate and what their uh, you know motivational you know elements are, what's driving them. That can help us take less personally our investment in what we've been pulled into. We can see that there's a shaping that's happened, and the mindfulness then can come back in a reinforcing way, note what's happening and let go. And generally there's a noospheric wisdom also that I'm recommending cultivating, which is just recognizing that we can navigate digital spaces while remaining grounded in embodied reality. And so just being mindful of the kind of the detachment that can happen when we get immersed too fully into the noosphere. And to bring a wisdom dimension to that is to recognize that this always has to be connected to our broader embodied living experience in a living world. So that's the dimension of working on the upper left. And then going over to the upper right, making deliberate behavioral efforts to diversify our information sources, intentionally seeking out varied and high quality perspectives beyond our filter bubble. I mentioned something called creating circuit breakers, because we get pulled
Yep.
into these, scrolling and clicking habits, and to deliberately or to respond to notifications continually, and just to deliberately interrupt that. And I think both you and I know people who regularly take digital sabbaticals, and I think that's a really wise thing to do, to make contact with a different dimension of reality that's not within those mediated bubbles, and to do that as a hygiene practice, and also deliberately selecting add-ons or apps or different kinds of things, different tools, transparency tools, so browser extensions, things like that, platform settings that can help forward for us how content is being filtered and promoted. So these are just basic behavior changes that will help us counteract at least some of the force of the algorithmic shaping that's going on, and disrupting some of the feedback loops that are unconsciously going on.
Yeah, you actually reading your paper caused me to subscribe to yet another service. So now I'm now a subscriber for Ground News. So thank you, Bruce. But it's a really interesting solution, because what it actually does, just for the sake of our audience, Ground News um, kind of tags or places on the political spectrum each different article or news story or whatever that gets published, and shows where is this story being picked up. Is it being picked up across the political spectrum? Is it picked up primarily in the center or the left or the right leaning outlets? And then once it starts to get a sense for what sort of news you're selecting for by which articles you're clicking on and reading from their website, it starts to show you what your potential blind spots are. So, what are the news stories that you're actively filtering out? And then it resurfaces those for you so you can be exposed to them. So, it's a really powerful tool in sort of making sure that you're at least hearing what people with different epistemic filters than you are prioritizing in their own news feed. So it's a really powerful tool. I appreciate you pointing it out.
Yeah, I've really appreciated it too. It's a good mindfulness tool, and and on the behavioral side, it helps you uh, navigate the information space in a more responsible way, more self-aware way, more critical way. Um, and yeah, on the lower left, I'm thinking about just we've got to foster new narratives around digital use. Uh, it's something that is in many ways just part of the water we swim in. We're just swimming in our digital environments, and we don't have sustained uh, dialogue around it, or people will watch the Social Dilemma, and there'll be some conversation. But I think we need to really focus on that in our education systems and in other contexts to just have broader cultural discussions around mindful intentional engagement with technology, making it a thing that we really become sensitive to, and as people now readily recognize that yoga and mindfulness are really good for aspects of our own self-care. We need to culturally develop some narrative and conviction around this, the importance of this literacy and mindfulness in these domains, and create communities of practice that help you do this. Um, there's a Bhaskar talks about something he calls a TINA formation, where communities get into spaces where they think there is no alternative. This is just the way things are, and it's almost never the way things have to always be. There are always ways. There are edges that we can cross and open up new spaces and new possibilities. And so I think we need to develop counter narratives that help you know challenge the unconscious TINA formations there. And cultural support really will help make individual change sustainable if we have broader cultural support and mindfulness of this, so that we're not just trying it on our own, to remember to use ground news or something, but that this is more broadly recognized and reinforced. And on the lower right in the systems, uh, you know, redesigning recommendation algorithms. Is it possible? And there are some very interesting experiments going in this direction that uh, prioritize, balanced reflective engagement over just maximization of it, engagement and capturing of attention. Things that actually deliberately work to slow down rather than speed up the digestion of content. Um, of course, at the level of policy, putting in regulations that prevent exploitative platform practices and force companies to have more algorithmic transparency about what they're doing and what kind of manipulations are going on. Um, Creating alternative economic models that shift away just from ad-driven engagement incentives towards models that support our well-being, and in to the degree that this is always profit-driven, that might be hard to implement. And so, how can we have something that is, you know, rightly protective of free speech and all of those kinds of things, but nevertheless, collectively ensure a focus on our overall cultural well-being rather than just the factors that drive corporate profits, something like that. So yeah, we need to basically, make some deep structural changes, identify deep structural causes, so that we can affect a long-term change rather than just, at the individual level. Often we're just addressing some of the more surface level. So we need at the systemic level to really look at what is currently in play and are there alternatives that can be built. The political paper I'm looking at, for instance, is looking at some of the technology around moral graphs and how those help to, they're algorithms that help to distill values and then feed the collectively emergent values back into the system rather than just focusing on what is maximizing attention.
Wow, I love that. Well, thank you, Bruce. That was a great tour through the sort of four quadrants of some of the things we might be able to do. And I think, you know, for one, just to pop out again and put our meta theoretical sort of lens on, it just for us integralists, we're so used to taking this four quadrants frame as a way of just thinking about the different kinds of problems we're facing and the different dimensions of them. But this is such a perfect example of how it can disclose powerful like shifts at an individual and collective level that would actually begin to improve this. if I may be forgiven for going back to the lower left for a second, it made me. I have a personal anecdote about this. I think in a lot of ways, the lower left is probably the most ignored. Like I can think of things that I've heard people recommend. Um, for dressing sort of digital polarization, things like that around, in particular, the upper right and lower right, and a little bit of the upper left. I've heard very little, suggested in the lower left, and it's why I think this is kind of an important one to concentrate on. We have been looking for kindergartens for my son, who's going to be entering kindergarten this fall, and we went to go check out a Montessori school. And the Montessori school, we went into their library, and they had, they had a library full of books and CDs, um, and they had an encyclopedia set. And so I asked about that. I said, obviously those encyclopedias are a little bit out of date. How do you supplement the students' knowledge, with digitally? What kind of work are you doing with computers and helping your students to navigate this? And their response was, well, we don't use computers. We don't use computers for anything. When we go take a field trip, the kids have to use paper maps to figure out where they're going. And on one level, I recognize that's beautiful. And there's certainly, it's sort of like a positive reactionary move to this, digital overwhelm and digital polarization that the next generation is going to have to, continue to carry up.
Mm.
So in some sense, I was impressed by that, and I found it interesting. On another, I felt these poor kids are going to have no, eventually they're going to have to go into the real world. They're going to have to use computers in their work, and they're going to have to sort of uh, interact more in these digitally mediated environments. And I have to think that they would be woefully unprepared because they haven't built, the personal skills, the awareness skills, the behavioral skills, and they haven't. The learning environment they were enculturated in didn't equip them to be able to navigate those and begin to take more conscious, what's positive, what's negative, what's the trade-off of depth and span that the next generation of citizens are going to be able to need to navigate.
I think that's a really great point. And yeah, I think we need to have schools which do teach literacy. And my son just went through, UC Berkeley in the computer science and engineering department. And in talking to him, I was surprised at actually how little, even in that area, there was attention paid to these kinds of issues or dynamics or the need for mindfulness around these things. And it actually wasn't there very much at all from what I've heard from him.
Were they prioritizing in-person exchange, or they were just doing a lot of, work and digital stuff, but not actually equipping their employees to be able to navigate that in a more conscious way?
The latter, yeah,
Yeah.
they definitely were assuming individuals to be living in that and working with that, but there didn't seem to be a lot of conversation around what's coming or the impacts of even what we have.
Yeah.
It seemed to be much more of a just a information dissemination and kind of a technical focus and not a broader cultural. I think you can find those broader cultural conversations happening from important people at the university, for sure, but they that didn't seem to be filtering down much from what I heard to the level of my son's classes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're gonna have to get better at it, that's for sure. We're approaching the hour and a half mark here, and then there's really one other thing. There's one other aspect of your paper that I wanted to at least touch on a little bit before we wrapped up, and that is this. You had one on cascading effects of meta cognitive awareness across quadrants, and so I'm going to switch our screen share to that for a second. So I keep popping out of sort of the actual narrative dialogue of what we're discussing and the sort of lenses that you applied to it and using these big picture integrative meta theoretical lenses. And I couldn't end our conversation without looking at this one because I feel like every integralist has their own sort of implicit quadrant causal sort of pattern that they prioritize, right? There's sort of a quadrants that start the change and quadrants that are the result of the change, and I thought yours was sort of interesting. I think is mine generally moves from, like, if I were to create a theory of change bouncing around the quadrants, I would start from the lower right, which creates the systems, to the upper right, which the systems shape the behavior shapes the individual consciousness in the upper left, and the individual consciousness in the upper left shapes and contributes to the collective cultural conditions. So that's my sort of typical theory of change using the quadrants. You chose one here that moves from the upper left to the upper right response, to the lower left impact, to the lower right evolution, and ultimately sort of driving the systemic effect. So um, I wonder if you could comment on why you chose that particular causal pathway, and then just briefly walk us through this, how you hope some of the changes that you're prescribing in this paper might end up having a larger systemic effect.
Well, obviously there's only one right way to go through the quadrants. And I hate to tell you, you're stuck in a demi-reality and just suffering there.
Thank you for piercing my demi reality, Bruce. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think there are actually, multiple places we could start. And in thinking about it, we probably want to start in multiple places at once. Um, I would say some rationale for starting with the upper left is that algorithmic systems operate beneath conscious awareness, and they're shaping our perceptions. And so without any metacognition, um, individuals trapped in a demi-reality, or getting pulled through algorithmic undertow into a demi-reality, won't realize that that's happening, and therefore won't have really any reason to consider alternatives or to think about making a change. So I just, the awareness that this is actually a dynamic that's happening seems to be important before making any changes, right? And so you could go from the upper left also to the lower right, right, where you recognize not only that am I going to change my behavior individually, but that if we really want lasting change, with that metacognitive awareness, recognizing that this is actually happening to all of us. We're all getting pulled in these directions. You might then jump to the lower right and want to begin to address the systems that are putting that in play. I think even if somebody is starting in the lower right, implicitly they had at first the upper left metacognitive awareness of the problem, and then started to work on systemic changes. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, just briefly, could you just sort of share with us what you were hoping this might disclose about how we could begin to address some of these challenges?
Yeah, yeah. Let me pull up your thing bigger here so I can see that better here. Um, yeah, and really, one of the terms I was using in there is kind of a cascade effect, right? And uh, wanting to appreciate how these domains play together,
Hmm.
not to take them in isolation, not to privilege, but to really think about how they all are reinforcing, and we really can move around the quadrants in multiple directions. And in approaching any kind of wicked mess, typically you do have to start from multiple places to have any uh, lasting impact. Though, as you and I, just worked on, we worked in the past on really trying to find what is maybe the primary locus of change that we want to focus on first, and then, how do we move? So, on the one hand, you could talk about you know, developmentally or not necessarily, I'm talking about stages, but in terms of the process of, yes, the upper left, you need a certain kind of recognition for anything else to be happening. But where you want to put your concentrated effort then could differ depending on where you think, the greatest impact is happening to or flowing from, the greatest causal impacts are flowing from. And I could make arguments basically both for the behavioral thing and the lower left systems thing. All of
Yep.
them have, we need a culture around it. We need behavior changes. We need systemic changes, and all of those things have to happen, in together. And I think maybe for all of us who are not working in industry, obviously where we would want to start is our behavior and the cultural choices that we make so that we are extricating ourselves from the impact of these things and can be, more balanced in our sense making and able to respond to multiple channels of information, but recognizing that unless deep changes don't happen at the systemic level, we're always going to have to be doing these little mitigating, behavioral changes and social insulating moves against something that we just take to be inevitably reinforcing, basically establishing the environment. So, they all have to happen at once, but we're all in different positions. There are certain people who are in a position to be able to make powerful changes to the actual systems themselves. Others culturally can exert a lot of force to make the systems change, right?
Yep.
So,
Yep.
yeah, I think collectively we just have to figure out where each of us sit. For myself, being mostly a teacher who focuses on, philosophy, theology, things like that, I'm not well placed to actually have much impact on, social drivers of policy or how AI companies are structured. But we can sit from our little ivory towers and say, you guys should be doing it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And we can also experiment, with
Yeah.
smaller models, build lightweight systems that might demonstrate what it would look like to, you know, change your filters that you're in terms of the information you're getting, or, experiment with our different social networks on ways we might be able to have a race to the top of collective sense making as opposed to a race to the bottom. I do think there are ways that there's a lot of experimenting that could be done at the individual and the sort of smaller scale social level that could point the way to more scalable solutions on this stuff.
Right, right. Yeah, that's well said. So I mean, I know we're close to our time, but recognition of the algorithmic shaping, that's really important, and it has, that's kind of what I was just talking about there. That we need to make changes in our engagement patterns. Once we recognize that, we need to develop new shared language, and we need to make platform changes, right? Or
Yep.
something about developing noospheric wisdom. Individually, we need to take up personal practices that help us remain grounded and connected to our living environments and our living communities, so that we keep the right sense of proportion in how we're digesting this information. And I think one of the deleterious effects is that we lose a sense of proportionality when
Hmm.
we're largely immersed in these environments. And sometimes people who take those digital, social media fasts, they rediscover that
Yep.
proportionality, right?
Yep.
And so then again, reinforcing cultural narratives around digital maturity. We don't have much talk, in our culture around what it would mean to be digitally mature. And
Hmm.
so, how can we do that? How can we really focus on that and begin to articulate criteria for what it would take to be a mature adult in a digital noospheric environment, right? And people like John Vervaeke and Alan Watkins, who are both, familiar with metamodern and integral spaces, they're focusing on wisdom cultivation,
Hmm.
within our system. So they're looking at how do we interface with these larger systems so that they get turned in the direction, not only of corporate profit or personal entertainment, but can they be actual, drivers of maturity and wisdom, collectively and individually. So again, those are just some examples, sampling in that field. But um, I hope you understand why you're absolutely wrong that there's a different starting point.
Well, thank you, Bruce. That was a great tour through that. And I think, yeah, I just want to just thank you and congratulate you again on this work. I think it is absolutely foundational. It's foundational in the sort of, again, as I said at the beginning, addressing the meta crisis. I think dealing with this particular issue uh, has so many later effects. This digital polarization that we're in has so many effects downstream in all the different crises that we're facing. If for no other reason that we don't have enough of a shared sense of reality and therefore what to do about it, that we can't find any kind of political consensus to deal with these massive problems that we're having. So in that way alone, it's pretty root causal to the many crises that we're facing right now. So I think you've done this movement and this space a real service by focusing on that as an issue. And then secondarily, I think you've done this space a real service in showing how these different big picture lenses can be layered over top one another to disclose new aspects of the problem and new solutions that start to become into focus by taking some of these big picture views. So you've done a lot with this one paper, and I just want to thank you for putting it out there in the world and for contributing to this work that we're all a part of at IAM, and for being such a great thought partner in our conversation today. It's been a great dialogue.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I really appreciated your questions. And I have to say, doing this paper, I really felt I was stepping outside of my comfort zone. I don't dwell a lot on issues of technology or these kinds of things. So it was it was a stretching for me to go here. But I feel you know somebody was pointing out about the meaning crisis, and if you feel that there's still a meaning crisis, maybe you're not paying attention, because I do feel there is a meaning crisis. But on the point that I think it was Hansi making is
Yeah.
that uh, we have so many things pressing us right now that are meaningful to engage with. That that could actually call us towards meaningful engagement and real
Yeah.
contribution in the world. And this was one area that just, for whatever reason, pulled me strongly. And so, yeah, happy to have added a little piece to the conversation.
Yeah, maybe a big piece. I think it was a real contribution, Bruce. And so, and to that end, I'm hoping I can't wait to see what your what bubbles up next for you and how you apply that big mind of yours to some of these big problems we're facing. So, thank you again, my friend, for your scholarship, your friendship, and your dialogue. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, wonderful to be here with you this morning.
Okay, talk to you soon, Bruce. Thanks.
Take care.